There's one brother on the floor there.
Oh, yeah.
Do you not believe that India should do automatic right? Oh, NLS versus NTU, what do you expect?
Call this house to order. Welcome to the Octofinals of this year's NTU UADC. Congratulations to both teams. My name is Arina, I'll be your chair. Paneling with me are Jake and Tana. Okay, considering that this is a pretty big crowd, I'd like to advise everyone to please keep your chairs to a minimum. If you have to leave the room, please do it in between speeches, not while the debaters are speaking. And keep your phone on silent mode or turn it off so not to distract the debaters. Alright, so on the Indian motion, let's invite the first Indian team to start off the case.
Madam Speaker, we think that when countries are located in a specific situation where they are able to reach out and help marginalized communities in other places, they have an obligation to do that. We also think that India should adopt such a move, specifically because it moves India more towards the side of secularism and because it helps the average man on the street. But first, let's understand the sort of dire problem that we are facing in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh today, right? We see that in some of these societies where the Hindu community constitutes a minority, there is a case of systemic oppression that they are subjected to. It takes a lot of forms, right? They're continuously denied certain economic opportunities. They have religious laws that persecute them and do not allow them to carry out their fundamental beliefs. Often, the sort of persecution even ends up in violent attacks against these communities by the majorities in these nations. We think that this is a major problem that effectively means that these Hindu minority communities in these countries are unable to lead normal lives in these other places. This is the sort of problem that we envisage these communities facing, and this is the problem where we want to step in and help them. So what do we mean by granting them an automatic right? We think an automatic right, as opposed to a status quo right, means that once we identify that a community is persecuted, any member of that community can come in and ask for our refugee status, and we will grant it to them. How is this different from status quo? In two ways. One, in status quo, we have to individually analyze whether or not an individual has credentials that make him eligible for refugee status. We are doing away with such sorts of individual scrutiny. Second of all, under status quo, we often place things like caps on the amount of refugees who can come in from certain places. That's also something that we want to do away with. If you are from a persecuted community, we will give you the right to refugee status in our country. Why exactly is this so important? Because now it's a question of the unique location and unique qualities that India holds in this regard. Because if you look at the sort of minority communities who espouse their Hindu beliefs, there are few alternatives that they have in the world where they can find solace. Because the sort of cultural affinity that a country like India can offer to them is not matched by any other place. There are also other reasons why India is the only choice that these people often have in many cases. First of all, purely in terms of access to come into the Indian borders from the places where they face discrimination, we think that India is one of the few options that they have when they want to escape this sort of persecution. Moreover, we think that there's an important element of political will that exists within India, which is why this move is likely to happen in India, but is unlikely to happen in a lot of other countries that may be able to give refugee, simply because we understand and have a cultural affinity with the sort of Hindus who are persecuted in other regions. However, we do understand that there are other communities who are not Hindus also who face persecution. So the question would be, why are we not giving them an automatic right to refuge? The answer is that we think they have alternatives which are not shared by these persecuted Hindu minority communities. So if you're a Shia Muslim in Pakistan and you face discrimination, you have other accessible options like Iran, which is not something that the Hindu minorities in Pakistan can access. India is indeed the only option that these people have if they want to lead a normal life. We also need to understand now the question of secularism, right? Because that's the first idea, the first benefit that we are going to put forward for you. We think by adopting this particular move, we're actually going to make India more of a secular nation. But before that, let's put forward what we mean by the idea of minority protections in India, right? And what the government is okay with. We think that all of the current protections that exist for non-Hindu communities in India, like Muslims, should continue. So nobody should be able to oppress them through the sort of legal measures that we have in place to protect them. But the problem that we have identified is that simply because Hindu communities constitute a majority of the Indian society, we have historically been scared to identify that certain Hindus are also vulnerable communities. And that's the sort of misperception that we want to correct, that Hindu communities can also be vulnerable communities. How has this manifested in the past, right? We have identified that certain Muslim or other religious minorities within India are of a vulnerable status, and we have given them special protections. For instance, Muslim communities are entitled to practice their own religious laws in India. Muslim or Christian educational institutions have certain special entitlements that are not shared by Hindu majoritarian educational institutions. Because of our reluctance to appear anti-secular, however, the result has been that we find it simply difficult to recognize that sometimes members of the majority community can also be in vulnerable status in other places. That's the misperception we are correcting when we say that even Hindu people are vulnerable and that they deserve certain special protections, such as the one that we are putting forward. Why is this important? Because right now, the prevailing sense on the Indian street for an average Hindu man is that he feels alienated by the government. Because of the continuous and historical trend that we have depicted, where we only prioritize certain minority communities within the country, we think there is a need to equalize the conversation between them. We think this will, in fact, reduce a lot of the hostility that exists from the majority community towards the minority communities in India. We think that, therefore, this is a move that benefits not just the majority of India, that is the Hindus, but in fact is also in the interest of minorities who do not want to be seen as the exclusive group that gets preferred in terms of the policies that the Indian government adopts. Before I move on, question.
Western Pakistan has a Hindu majority and a chief minister who's Hindu. What is this political persecution about?
Because the constitution and the legal structure of a country like Pakistan is so biased against your ability to practice that religion freely that you do face persecution. If your case really is that Hindus enjoy complete freedom in Pakistan, then that's something that we are really looking forward to contest, right? What we mean is this idea that as if you do not alienate the man on the street, then that's a good thing. That's not only for the majority of people in India, but also for the minority. But we also think that the question of resources is something that we need to consider in this debate. We are okay with the resources that the other side may accuse us of spending on these refugees for two reasons. First of all, we think that given the large population that India currently has and the minority status of these communities in other countries, an influx of refugees even will not constitute much of an additional burden on our resources. But secondly, and more importantly, unlike countries like Australia, India in any case is not a strong welfare state. So it's not the case that if you are merely within India, we anyway give you things like strong healthcare protections or that the government spends a lot on your education. So we don't think our resources are going to be unfairly diverted simply because these refugees step into our country, which is also why we're okay with the idea of taking up this obligation. But this is an obligation that needs to be respected. These are people who face grave difficulties in other places, and we think that given our unique locational advantages and the sort of ability that we can give to these people to lead normal lives, given the fact that we can therefore move our country towards a more secular plane and help both majorities and minorities, and given the fact that we don't mind bearing the cost, we should be very proud to propose this motion.
Yeah. Our stance from opposition is very simple. Acceptance of refugees can never be automatic. It should always be on a case-by-case analysis of the situation each individual finds himself in. Acceptance of refugees is a zero-sum game, contrary to what you would like to believe, because if it wasn't, he would have opened the borders to everyone and not had borders at all. Madam Speaker, if these persecuted Hindus are actually being persecuted that bad, they will still find solace in India under a policy, in a case-by-case policy. But we don't think it should be automatic, and just because you're Hindu, you should be accepted over someone who's grieving and harm, maybe objectively more than you, but he happens not to be Hindu. But even if we accept implicitly that Hindus will be accepted, we'd rather not make it an explicit policy and not tell all the minorities, given the fact that the Narendra Modi is in power, that we're going to alter the religious makeup of our country even more. I have three arguments. Firstly, the right to refuge and right should be a secular need. Secondly, Hindu nationalism and the destruction of the social fabric in India and the problems that can happen from that. And thirdly, India's perception as a global power. Now, rebuttals will be integrated, but a few points will stand out. It is false to say, and especially in a debate like this, you need to prove in a compelling manner that there is actual persecution of Hindu minorities across the board. I told you, Madam Speaker, that in Pakistan, especially Western Pakistan, there is a majority of Hindus and Sikhs who find political representation. The fact that the Chief Minister of the Punjab region in Pakistan is Sikh, for example. There are democratic ways for these parties to get access to democratic freedoms, right? In Bangladesh, for example, Hindu parties almost always run for seats and have won many seats within these parliaments. The fact that India has often pressurized these countries not to persecute Hindus, right? These are all things which point towards a situation in which there are rights which exist. There is democratic accountability, and that they've never shown us why the situation is as bad as you say it is. But his second argument was this, that Hindu majority individuals feel alienated on the ground, and hence we must do this. A Hindu BJP-led nationalist government who won on the predicament of saying that we are a Hindu government has come to the biggest majority India has seen in 30 years. I think any of those problems of being not anti-minority are going to be resolved by seeing the man you idolize as being the Hindu leader of your country be in such a compelling majority. I don't think that's particularly a problem. Why is right to refuse and why should be a secular need? We think the reason why people often seek refuge is when they are fleeing wars, when their lives are destroyed and they're facing explicit persecution on an individual basis. We think religion should never define and should never alter how objective this harm to an individual is. This harm should be measured objectively and shouldn't depend on the lottery of religion, right? Just because you were born Hindu, your harm is suddenly being seen as far greater and you've been given an easy path to refuge, Madam Speaker. We think given the fact that many refugees are often competing for the same resources, right? The fact that you can't have a limited number of people entering your borders, because if that was true, then their policy wouldn't be Hindu specific in the first place, points to the fact that there's always a zero-sum game when it comes to refugees, and need should always be prioritized over you being of a particular religion. What is their policy going to do? It's going to have a massive flood of Hindus from Bangladesh and Pakistan who are now going to take away the opportunity for others who may be objectively facing far worse consequences and put them back in the same consequences just because they were not born Hindu. But secondly, Hindu nationalization and destruction of the fabric. And they would know this, right, law students. Secularism is an enshrined part of the Indian constitution. The very reason why India's mixed demographic of Hindus and Muslims has been able to coexist is because of the fact that the constitution protects them. However, this fabric has been destroyed and there have been particularly bad consequences of this, right? The fact that in 2002, in the state led by Narendra Modi in Gujarat, thousands of Muslims were slaughtered on the streets while he did nothing. This was when the secular fabric of the nation was altered and people were killed. Now you have the same BJP government that in the 1980s destroyed India's biggest mosque, supported by the RSS, who's a political institution who Narendra Modi continues to be a member of. Now you have this man with a tainted history of violence against Muslims as the prime minister with the biggest Hindu majority the country has ever seen. Imagine the sense of insecurity in the Muslim population that already exists in the country, given that this man who killed so many of their brethren is now in power as one of the most powerful political figures that India has ever seen. What does their policy do? Like, given the fact that the insecurity exists already, it sends a chilling warning to minorities and Muslims who get grim reminders of the violence that BJP perpetrated against them. You have a BJP-led government who now says we will allow Muslim-only individuals, Hindu-only individuals to come into our own country, while rejecting not only people of the Muslim faith, but all of the faiths. So we're okay with accepting hundreds and thousands of new Hindus and altering the religious makeup of your country and putting your existence to even worse threat. What does this do? A few consequences. It fuels violence, and this has happened before. Insecurity of Muslims has led to violence before in the 80s and as recently as 2002. You put hundreds and thousands of people's lives at risk when you tell the Muslim communities that the government is out to get you. That's the kind of stuff that leads to riots and violence against the state, and that's the kind of thing that you put hundreds and thousands of people to risk at. But secondly, you allow opposition members, especially the Congress, who've seen a massive defeat, to polarize the minorities, right? You give them an opportunity to fuel rhetoric in in the opposition and fuel rhetoric of the minorities against the majority, and that's what leads to even more violence, Madam Speaker. But thirdly, you push and fuel Hindu nationalism on the ground when the Hindu nationalist person who's already seen as being empowered by Narendra Modi being in power now sees an explicit policy by his government saying you must target Muslims, right? Now that this nation is Hindu only, and we should always prioritize Hindu, and the state's forecast from now on will be only Hindu. Because the only way people ever judge their governments are often based on these actions. Now these Muslims get a message that at least the next 4 years will be only Hindu, right? That's the kind of message you send to minorities, and that's the problems that you create on the ground. Before I go on, yes.
Does it strike you that the fact that the Hindus in India have shifted their political loyalty and have now elected a pro-Hindu party is a manifestation of the political alienation that they have faced?
I don't think it's just, elections aren't just won on Hinduism. The fact that a big platform for Narendra Modi's win was things like economics doesn't mean that the only reason he's in power is because he's Hindu. But the perception of Muslims isn't that, right? The fact that the same person who persecuted them is now in power and is putting in policies which restrict members of their community from entering and alters the makeup of the country is not what the minorities think is going to be right. But thirdly, India is a global power, and this is extremely important. The fact that India wants to be a massive power and wants to be seen as a stronger player on the international community, both in the humanitarian and secular front. The fact that India has always been one of the most secular nations ever since its constitution has been in place. But the problem is the international community is already extremely skeptical of the Modi government. The fact that the US denied him a visa in 2005 because of the very crimes that he was charged for against Muslims. The fact that many foreign leaders have expressed concern about his past and a man of such a past coming to power in a secular nation like India. Their policy destroys India's image as a secular nation, which it has established over almost like 60 years. India is now seen as an extremist, non-secular nation which is willing to establish a majority when they're in power. They're not seen anymore as a neutral arbiter. They're not seen as an individual who would be welcome on the international platform, as an individual the Western countries would like to fund and sponsor and see on the same table, because they're seen as being exclusive. They're seen as being willing to impose on a minority who has already suffered enough, Madam Speaker. We think that's a bad thing in and of itself. You lose large amounts of international soft power and your image as a neutral secular body is tainted. Because of the fact that minorities already feel insecure in India, and because their policy increases that, and because acceptance of refugees should only be based on objective harm and not what religion you belong to, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. You can continue to the bench. I'd like to invite the
Madam Speaker, the first misrepresentation on their side of the house, right, that somehow we're closing our border to other minority communities, that we don't want to let persecuted Muslims in, or we don't want to let persecuted Christians in. This is patently untrue. We told you that we will let persecuted Shias in from Pakistan if they feel that there is a genuine existential threat to their life. But yes, we are going to subject them to case-by-case scrutiny, and yes, we are going to allow Hindus in on a community basis, and we think we are justified in doing so, and I'll tell you why. First, we gave you a lot of analysis in First Speaker that was completely ignored by side opposition, who just told you Modi is bad. But whatever, we tell you that the reason that they've ignored this is because we think Hindus are in a special place of vulnerability in the areas they're being persecuted. Look at Pakistan, look at Bangladesh, and let's look at the areas around that who are willing to accept immigrants, and let's actually analyze the position of Hindus. We say that every country, before it decides whether or not to take in Hindus, has to face countervailing narratives. It has to, on one hand, look at the sympathy it feels for a persecuted individual. On the other hand, it has to look at genuine problems, like letting in someone that you don't necessarily feel cultural affinity with, and therefore causing tension within your own community, or letting someone in and therefore pushing yourself into greater resource constraints than you may have previously. But we say, because of the nature of the countries surrounding the Hindus who are being persecuted, Iran, right, or to the rest of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India on this hand, we say that compared to the way these countries would react to Hindu refugees, it is almost obvious that India would react more favorably, because there is a greater cultural welcoming for Hindus, and therefore we think we're uniquely positioned to help them. But secondly, on the simple idea of geographical location, if you're a persecuted Shia in Pakistan, you can walk over to Iran. If you're a persecuted Hindu in Pakistan, the only country that you can walk over to with any chance of a better life is India. We say that because of your sense of special vulnerability, and because of the lack of real meaningful alternatives, we have to give this country greater favorability. But second on this idea that we have to be absolutely equal in the way we treat non-citizens. We say that in the way, look at the way the US processes its visa applications, right? And the kind of scrutiny it subjects Indian to, and the kind of scrutiny it subjects someone from the European Union to. We say that countries don't always follow strict equality in the way they assess the way they let refugees in. We say what we're doing in this case is following a slightly paternalistic standard to look at what would be the best environment for this refugee if he comes in. The truth remains that if a vulnerable person from Bangladesh comes in and he is Muslim, he is subject to greater threats in India than a Hindu would be, because the environment is, all said and done, slightly more favorable towards Hindus than to Muslims. We say, in fact, under our paradigm, it is reasonable to allow Hindus in, because it is true that they can acculture themselves better in India than anyone else could. We say our standard is paternalistic and justified. Now let's move on to Modi bashing, something that we've heard quite significantly from the other side. Let's look at two things. First, we say that the characterization of Muslims and the way Muslims react to Modi on the other side has been extremely simplistic. We say, in fact, that in places like Uttar Pradesh, for the first time, the BJP has won 78 out of 85 seats after so very many years in India. And the analysis of the vote share has proven that in these places, the surge of Muslim vote for the BJP has actually increased. We say that this extreme sense of alienation with Muslims living under threat to bodily integrity under Modi is simply not true. But even if Muslims are not very happy with Modi, in fact, a lot of Hindus are also not very happy with Modi, let's look at what really we should be looking at in terms of secularism and how to make secularism progress. Let's look at the way Aditya Mitra characterized the idea of how a Muslim man on the street feels in India, or how secularism should be interpreted in India. He thinks any special status given to vulnerable Hindus is anti-secular. Any special status given to the minority community of Muslims or Christians in status quo is secular. Unfortunately, you or I may not think that's a wrong position to take, but the average Hindu on the street feels alienated simply because this is the way secular discourse has been shaped in India. Let's look at what makes the average Hindu on the street feel alienated, right? They look at themselves and they ask, when I want to go to a Hindu holy site like Amarnath or some place like that, like Kashi, I don't get subsidy from the state. But when a Muslim wants to go to Hajj, my state pays him. This average Hindu asks himself, when my temple is mismanaged and it has a lot of wealth, the state steps in, takes over that temple and starts managing the temple. But where a mosque or a church is similarly mismanaged, there is no provision under Hindu law to take these temples over. They're scared by rumors such as the large gold in a temple in South India called Tirupati being taken away to the national treasury simply to balance our deficit. What they feel is this, right? A lot of these perceptions may not be reasonable for someone sitting in this room, but you need to understand how the average Hindu on the street thinks. He thinks that this is a state that wants to favor Muslims unduly, give them special privileges, but not treat Hindus the same way. We say that what we do under our policy is very simple. We expand the definition of vulnerability to include truly vulnerable Hindus from other parts of India. We tell you that this is a state that will not only treat the vulnerable minority communities within India in a favorable way, we will also treat vulnerable Hindus from around the world in the same way. We say that this will go to a long way in cutting down this rhetoric of alienation among Hindus. We say then that they will be able to refocus their energies from hating Muslims for being pseudo-secular or appeased in a country like India and into moving on to a more inclusive way of looking at them, of looking at the state as treating them more equally and therefore not feeling any need for rebalancing within the community.
If they're actually so badly persecuted, they will find solace under our policy as well. Why does it need to be an explicit policy telling the minorities that it's a Hindu-only policy?
Okay, why? I'll tell you why. Because the average Hindu on the street does not examine the refugee policies of the government. And these kind of symbolisms mean a huge deal to the dumb person on the street. When you tell him we are letting Hindus in, because they're persecuted, that means much more than by saying we will analyze every case on a case-by-case basis. And if we do in fact find factual evidence of persecution, we will in fact let that person in. We say the image of symbolism and the message that you convey of being a Hindu and therefore being let in means a lot to this average person who feels this alienation. That is something you or I may not perceive, but that is a stakeholder that we are catering to in this debate. Finally, let's come to the idea of resources and the idea of balancing resources. We told you that the harm is in fact not. First, I told you that our case-by-case policy actively excludes people who feel more suffering. First, we told you that's not true. Second, they told you that Muslims aren't in fact persecuted in Pakistan. We say this is not true. First, in Western Pakistan, Muslims are a majority. That was one reason why Western Pakistan was partitioned away from Punjab, which was considered to be a Hindu majority area by the British. And more importantly, we tell you, wearing a bindi in Pakistan, right, wearing a mark on your forehead and walking out on the street in Pakistan, having a temple destroyed in Pakistan, having the state repeatedly tell you that it's an Islamic state, can take a toll on the way you exercise your religious freedom. We say that you cannot be Hindu on the streets in Pakistan, you can be a Muslim on the street in India, and this does place a special vulnerability on you. If all we have to do is let one more poor person in and give him an extra meal per day, we think that's a resource constraint that the Indian state can in fact bear. We don't think there's anything wrong with doing so. It's not that much of a burden, and we're willing to take it. For all of these reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite the NTU development.
As the only Chinese person in this debate, I feel most fit to discuss minority oppressions. So let's examine the calculus of this debate. The minute you are concerned about the sensitivity of Hindu-Muslim sentiments within the entire region, then this debate is entirely won and lost on perceptions of India sent out locally and abroad, something we think the DPM began to agree with in her substantive. Basically, because if anything happens to Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan, we are going to take them in any way under our own asylum policy. The issue, therefore, is not about protecting really vulnerable and oppressed Hindus, but how you go about doing it. That is precisely why I have a problem with their national policy of unconsidered acceptance based solely on Hindu identity. We think that it's worse for any sensitivities both locally and within the region. So we realize that Modi, as a new leader who has been pressured by both local and international parties to temper his Hindu nationalist supremacist stance, the worst thing he can do right now is to say, we are explicitly acting to exclusively protect Hindus. We are not an Indian state, first and foremost, but a Hindu one. And that is the message being sent out. Before I begin, 3 rebuttals. First and foremost, on advancing secularism in India, it's really ridiculous, right? That for the PM, equality and secularism in India is basically special treatment to different groups. But notwithstanding the irony of that, let's first look at the Hindus. We don't think that the Hindus in India themselves are disadvantaged, right? Something that was considered entirely in a deputy. We realize that the Hindus are a great majority in the country. And more importantly, given the advent of Modi into power, right? Someone who never condemned the 2002 Gujarat killings, someone who was a member of the RSS, and someone who has always consistently used the Muslims as an outgroup or enemy in his campaign speeches, implying Muslims to be state enemies. We realize that therefore, Hindus can in no way be called the oppressed ones. But what did they tell us? They told us that Hindus voted in Modi because now they feel their interests are really oppressed. First and foremost, the Hindus voted in Modi because they felt he was the only one that can mend the rotting economic infrastructure within the country itself. But even if they did, right, first and foremost, if you are not oppressed, we don't think there's a need for us to try and further your unfair advantage. Secondly, as the Prime Minister, Modi should therefore look at what benefits the whole state, including your Muslim minority. But even if it's true that your Hindus are somehow strangely oppressed in India, right, there's an argument for helping the Hindus in India themselves, protecting your temples, and not taking other Hindus and not becoming a Hindu state in nature, and therefore allowing Hindus in the country to push any supremacist advantage any further. No, thank you. Let's look at the Muslim minority within India itself. Why are there policies out there to help the Muslim minority in India to begin with? Because we recognize as a minority, there must be things done to restore their balance, to give them equal opportunities. So we realize that extending automatic entry to only Hindus, precisely because they're Hindus, will advance any fear or reality of Hindu religious nationalism for the Muslims in the Muslim minority state of India. We realize furthermore, and this will pleasure DPM's point, or the message created to the state as a whole, right? That now it's even more oppressive for Muslims out there. Because now being Hindu is your key entry card into India. For India as a state to ally itself solely the fate of Hindus on the basis of faith, therefore refashions itself as a Hindu state. We see a parallel with things like Israel's right of return, right? Which basically is only valid because it's premised on the idea that Israel's core is Jewish. And that is a problem that brings me on to my second rebuttal, precisely that India is not a Hindu state. Before I go to that, we would like to give a point.
Yes. So let's tell you, yes, the Muslims may be vulnerable in India, but why does that entitle them to a Hajj pilgrimage? This is what the average Hindu man is asking. Tell me how you will respond to him through your policies.
The way to be fair to both the minority and majority in India, right, is to look at both their interests, to recognize that Muslim oppression must be dealt with, Hindus must be treated fairly, and you don't bring in other people just because they are Hindu. Because you respect how the minority and the majority both feel. It's really that simple. And that brings me on to my next point on why India is not a Hindu state, right? Because even if the Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan can only walk to India, look, we tell you that the international community does matter in terms of oppressions within nations. We also told you that our policy allows for oppressed Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan to come in, but even if they can only walk to India, right? Where can the Muslims of India walk to? India's first priority is to its people, regardless of their faith, because they are the citizens under its purview. And that is why you must put the fate of Muslim minorities and how they feel first and foremost. Then it brings me nicely on to my final rebuttal. And thank you. Is the problem so bad as to warrant their blanket policy of entry? There are cases based on two premises. First and foremost, that there is Hindu oppression in Pakistan and Bangladesh. We told you that Hindus have often been given political power in these two countries, their parties, and localized power. That was not dealt with, or should say that was not true. We don't think it's a valid rebuttal. But furthermore, right, even if it's that bad for them, we said multiple times we would take them into just on a case-by-case basis. We never really saw why that was invalid. The second premise they had then was that India is the only country that facilitated it in. But we see an inconsistency about whether refugees really strain the country or not, right? Because the PM came out and told us, no, there's really no strain. But if there is no strain, then why do you worry that no other state can provide that sort of care? We see a tension here. But if there's really a strain on India when you bring in refugees, then there's a problem therefore when you prefer Hindus over any other refugees that your limited resources can handle. But don't we realize, right, that the Muslims in India are therefore going to lose out because you spend your resources on protecting Hindus that were never your citizens to begin with. We also don't think you're going to solve the problem anyway, right? Because we think that's going to create even more incentive for Bangladesh and Pakistan to clamp down even harder on oppressed Hindus within their country, since they can easily go off to India anyway. That brings me very nicely onto my case, where I'll look at what it does to the entire South Asian region. We realize that India has a status as a powerhouse in the South Asian region due to its great economic growth. The consequence of that is that actions that affect the region as a whole carry much symbolism and practical meaning. This right to refuge makes India seem very overbearing and threatening to its Muslim minority neighbors, therefore spoiling already tenuous South Asian ties. How? Two reasons. Firstly, it strains ties with Bangladesh and Pakistan. It encourages Hindu belligerence in Bangladesh and Pakistan. Because now India is saying, do whatever you want, we will protect you. It encourages sectarian conflicts and Hindu extremism in these countries, right? So when the Indian Raw, the Intel group, right, was said to support Hindu violence in these two countries. It also allows for overt intervention in minority affairs in Bangladesh and Pakistan. We realize that this is the idea behind is that using our economic capacity as a country to give refuge, to intervene in sensitive minority affairs that Bangladesh and Pakistan want as sole authority to themselves. It's also an overexpression of disapproval over how you manage your people, therefore encroaching on Bangladesh and Pakistan's own ideas. We realize that that's also bad for India, right, when you offend Bangladesh and Pakistan in this way. Simply because now Pakistan, when it commits offenses that hurt India, for instance, in the past when it instigated the terrorists, made fun of the terrorists that instigated the Mumbai attacks, now Pakistan can deflect international attention or condemnation on all this by saying, well, look at the hypocrisy of India, look at what it is doing to us. So you have to destabilize already tenuous relationships in this region and make things worse for all people within these three countries. For all those reasons, therefore, because India is not a Hindu state, India has many other local and regional interests to watch out for, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite government.
Give me a second. Yeah. Madam Speaker, two principal clashes in this debate. One, what is the need for this policy? And second, what is the effect of this policy, both internally and externally, in terms of India's image, soft power, etc. First, the need for the policy. This is something that oppositions contested consistently, right? They claim that there is really no Hindu persecution, or persecution of Hindus outside the country, and therefore we don't need to bring them in. Their examples from first speaker was, oh, well, West Pakistan has a Sikh chief minister, and there are certain parties that are Hindu in Bangladesh that contest for elections. You understand, obviously, of course, that neither of these indicate that Hindus have actual rights on the ground. On the contrary, in Western Pakistan, I must have been dreaming, for example, when 3 temples were demolished there just last month, Hindu temples, under a Sikh chief minister's rule, primarily because for the Sikh chief minister and the Muslim majority in that area, again, Hindu rights aren't a particular priority. In addition, employment concerns in Lahore last year, in which Hindus were actively discriminated against on the basis of the fact that they are Hindu, on the basis of the fact that countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh explicitly acknowledge themselves as Muslim majority nations and therefore don't provide constitutional rights for any other religion in and of themselves. Unlike India, they don't make a claim to providing equal protections to all religious communities. It's extremely important. My first two speakers have given you clear examples of how religious expression, the right to go to a temple, the right to wear what you want, the right to practice your religion on the streets, to have festivals, etc., are things that are clamped down upon, in addition to things like you aren't getting jobs and your places of worship are getting actively demolished because, of course, the chief minister isn't really a Hindu. These are things you must remember. Bangladesh, again, even though it has parties that are Hindu that are contesting elections, has such extreme minorities in the parliament of Bangladesh that, again, they have zero protections in the constitution for Hindus at all. Unlike what India affords to Christians, Muslims, etc., the need is very clear. The second thing they tell us is, why do we need to do this as a community, right? If we are preserving the right to refuge on a case-by-case basis, why exactly is it important to let them all in? Now, here's a clear response to this that we've already given from the second speaker, and I'll reiterate, excuse me. It's the fact that if you give a case-by-case basis, the process is very often difficult. Why is that? Because the priority you have in a case-by-case for refugees is simply that you reconcile what resources you think you can spend on refugees and then look at what needs you think the refugees have. Which means, again, the needs of the refugees aren't prioritized. Why is this okay for other communities? It's because we realize that if, for example, you have a Muslim refugee who comes to our border and seeks refugee, and we believe he is maybe fairly oppressed, but not oppressed enough for our own case-by-case standards, he has alternative countries to which he can go, where in countries like Iran, he gets constitutional and legal religious protection, right? Hindus, however, don't have alternatives. Hindus can't go to Iran and get protections they need. Hindus can't go anywhere else and be expected to be treated even fairly, because in all of those countries, whether it's Myanmar on this side or Iran on this side, if they cross the border to the other adjacent neighboring country, they don't get fair treatment legally. They're in communities in which Muslims, in certain cases, and Sikhs in others, are given extra rights and Hindus are not, where they can't get employment and can't get jobs. Which is why, because the community of Hindus lacks an alternative, in the event that we find on a case-by-case basis, under status quo, that a particular Hindu isn't needful enough to be entered in, he must go back to his country. He can't go anywhere else. And that's a huge problem. And that's a part of the reason, a big part of the reason why we're giving you automatic rights. Because you can't go anywhere else. You can't access basic rights anywhere else. In addition, we tell you very clearly that we think the threat of abuse is very small. We don't think people will automatically uproot themselves from, let's say, Pakistan and walk across the border simply because they think it's fun, right? We think most refugees do come for refuge primarily because they're desperate. And I think they're fairly agree with this. Therefore, the primary problem they had, Madam Speaker, with this idea is not threat of abuse in terms of refugees abusing resources, but in terms of what message this sends out. And I'll deal with the message in the second clash, right? This is the message that I talk about in the clash of effect that this policy has on the image of India domestically and externally. Last speaker obfuscated significantly. She said this will make us a Hindu state. Yes, because affording Hajj pilgrimage subsidies to Muslims makes us a Muslim state, or affording special protections to Christians in the country and allowing their churches to have special tax protections makes us a Christian state. It really doesn't. The point of Indian secularism is very simple. We identify vulnerable communities irrespective of religion and we give them the protection they need. It means that if you are a religious community and you're vulnerable for whatever reason, we will ensure that that is corrected. The problem that my very first speaker pointed out and they refused to engage with is the idea that we often don't construe certain people, for example, Hindus who live abroad, as vulnerable, right? And this is a problem because even though we define our political community domestically as citizens, people religiously identify with a global religion religious community, which means they think that we, as a majoritarian Hindu country, in terms of at least how many Hindus there are, refuse to acknowledge that there are certain Hindus who live right next door in Pakistan who are in serious trouble, and we want to give them the benefits that they deserve as they're vulnerable. But vulnerable Muslims and Sikhs and Christians do get economic benefits. That's a huge part of the problem, and that's where we come to the engagement of the idea that, which is, of course, again, what first speaker and second speaker told you, which is, oh, Muslims will get really mad at this, that they'll feel further alienated. We understand that the message can be spun by, let's say, the Congress in the opposition. We understand in the short term, Muslims may feel a little threatened. We do, however, believe that the root cause for their feeling threatened, the root cause for their feeling alienated, is actually being corrected here. Why is that? It's because a big part of the reason why there are Hindu-Muslim riots and violence on the streets, why, for example, Muslims face adverse repression, etc., is because is because Hindus in particular feel resentment towards Muslims, right? They think, oh, look, there are vulnerable Hindus across the border who we won't protect, but there are vulnerable Muslims who we are protecting. That's a huge part of the reason why you do have Hindu-Muslim conflicts. We therefore believe that if we give this very rational policy of appeasement towards Hindus, you reduce that conflict, because you show these majoritarian Hindus that, look, we are protecting everyone irrespective of religion, and therefore the cause for conflict is reduced. Go on. Question, go ahead.
Who faces a greater incentive riot in modern India? Hindus who have a Hindu majority leader already in power, or Muslims who have the INC kicked out of power already?
Thank you for this. They haven't really decided why Hindus elected Modi. So in the first speech, they say, oh, Hindu elected Modi because they love Hinduism. Then they say economics. But aside from that, the fact that they elected Modi as the prime minister indicates that this resentment exists, right? It indicates that they believe that they need to address Hindu interests a little more. If that's the case, the only responsible thing to do would be to ensure that that resentment isn't exceeded, and that resentment doesn't affect minority communities. We understand again that certain Muslims might feel threatened by this, but their chance of actual physical threat is going down because the Hindus, who are the majority, who are repressing these communities, are significantly happier. They are considerably more content with policies such as giving special rights to Muslim minorities, because now you're also affording protection to other vulnerable communities, which means the reason for this conflict, for this differential analysis goes down, and Hindus become significantly more peaceful. Finally, international perception. We tell you two responses to this. First, if we give this right to Hindus, we ensure that Hindus in those countries have significantly larger bargaining power. In addition, we are perfectly fine with losing any potential alliances with neighboring Muslim countries if, conversely, we can ensure that we can protect Hindus in those countries and vulnerable people in those countries and use our economic power, increase bargaining power for that purpose. We again believe that our side of the house is the one that affords better protection to these people, that affords in the long run that you have better international perception by giving Hindus bargaining power. We are very, very proud to propose, Madam Speaker.
The irony on Gov of suggesting that they want to be a secular nation that gives priority to Hindus cannot be lost. Because we think at the end of the day, if they want to be a secular nation, they cannot say that they want to give a particular policy that targets only one particular religion. We're going to do three things in this speech. One, we're going to look at a problem-solution mismatch on side government. Two, we're going to look at the principle of nowhere else to go that Hindus apparently have. Thirdly, we're going to look at the harms of the perceptions that come out from this policy. Let's start with problem-solution mismatch. Problem on government was A, Hindus don't get paid to go to Kasi while Muslims get to go to Hajj. 2, temples get regulated when mosques don't. And 3, that Hindus feel like the state prioritizes the Muslims in domestic policies instead of them. One, we say not necessarily true, because, for example, Hindu temples don't get taxed in India, while all the other facilities in India actually do, which means there is some kind of balance for it. But 2, it made absolutely no sense why the policy that solves Hindus not getting paid to go to Kasi was automatic right to refuge for foreigner persecuted Hindus. The link was tenuous. We tell you if the problem was that Hindus aren't getting paid to go to Kasi or that the temples were getting more regulated than your mosques, the solution would be to pay your Hindus to go to Kasi and to regulate your mosques equally as with your temples. We didn't understand why foreigners that were persecuted were the solution to the problems. Link tenuous. But secondly, we tell you, a lot of their problems are likely to be solved anyway, considering they have Hindu nationalist government that has just been elected. I think because they have a rhetoric of being Hindu nationalists in coming in, it is a matter of time because before all of the problems on that side were going to be solved anyway. So really, their problem didn't match their solution. But let's then come into the persecuted Hindus of Pakistan and Bangladesh and what we do for them. The argument from them was that these particular Hindus have nowhere else to go and can only go to India. That didn't really make much sense because their response to like, what about other communities in these countries was to say, well, Muslims can go to Iran. Really? What about, say, Muslims in Bangladesh? How are you going to bring them to Iran? Fly them to Iran? We think that you also need to walk to India, right? Because Bangladesh is between India and China. We think that you have to walk to India as well. If you think of things like after the floods in Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of Muslims were displaced because of it, their alternative was also solely India. We think they have no opportunity otherwise to say to go anywhere else. But secondly, we say even if there was nowhere else to go, even if India was the only place for them and they were so persecuted and they really needed refuge, our policy allows for that, allows for these persecuted Hindus to end up in India and get all the protections they needed. Because on both sides, harmed individuals will still get to India. The difference is, on that side, individuals who are not harmed in Bangladesh or Pakistan, purely for, say, living in a persecuted area or coming from a particular sect of Hindus that are being persecuted in Bangladesh or Pakistan, will also move to India simply for the sake of better prospects in India and use their title or use their advantage of being of a persecuted community and still get into India. DPM conceded at some point, right, that this debate wasn't about action because both sides' actions eventually lead to the same thing, that harmed individuals or harmed Hindus will get into India. That means this debate is about perceptions and which side's perception of policy actually works. Before we go into that, go.
Where do you think the vulnerabilities of Hindus lie? Is it in not getting tax breaks for their temples or not getting protection for their temples? Or does it lie most in being persecuted by other majoritarian communities in other countries? We are targeting vulnerability.
Okay, look, you cannot conflate Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan with the Hindus in India, right? The Hindus in India are not being persecuted and they are not vulnerable and they have the majority power and they have the ability to make changes within their own country because of the Hindu nationalist rhetoric in the country. The actual vulnerable persecuted Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan, we can still protect without the policy of side government. What we're looking at isn't the ability to conflate people's problems and troubles and suggest that every Hindu needs to take upon themselves the cause of protecting other Hindus in other countries. Let's look at message sent. The only problem that side government had was that Hindus on the ground needed to stop resenting minority Muslims in India and that they needed to feel happier about themselves. That link was tenuous. They never told us why, because the Hindus in the country now can accept other Hindus from Bangladesh or Pakistan and have more of their religious makeup within their country, that Muslims will be less resented or happier, or that the link between more Hindus in the country and an increasing preference for Hindus would suddenly mean that they would feel less angry at Muslims or less hurtful towards the Muslim community. That link was never made for us. But let's look at all of the other things we wanted to tell you on our side that we had absolutely no response to, right? We told you, one, it increased or encouraged Hindu belligerence within Bangladesh or Pakistan. It meant that more people were willing to take risks at standing up against the problems in Bangladesh and Pakistan. But the result was that Bangladesh and Pakistan would be more willing to clamp down on the vulnerable Hindus within their country because they can just say, hey, you have India to run to if anything happens. I don't need to protect you. I don't need to give you any policies because you have India to run to if you want to. That was problematic for the very vulnerable people they wanted to protect on that side because it hurt the ability to protect them even more. But secondly, we told you it hurt foreign relations with Bangladesh and Pakistan in general because it meant that you had the ability to over-intervene in minority affairs in that country. It was absolutely abhorrent for government whip to come up here and say, we don't care about foreign relations with our neighbors, screw Bangladesh and Pakistan, we just want to protect our Hindus. Doesn't work that way, right? We think that at the end of the day, you need Bangladesh and Pakistan for a lot more than just the individual people on the ground. Your trade relations, your defense, your security, you need Bangladesh and Pakistan to be on your side and work with you. But secondly, we told you that you further polarize the minorities within India, that your insecurity of minorities that increases, your opposition parties that can use or polarize the minorities, the increased rhetoric of Hindu supremacist groups getting the power to further oppress Muslims, hurt the very stability of domestic politics on the ground and hurt the stability of relations within the ground. She accepted this in Deputy Prime Minister when she said that most individuals don't really analyze refugee policy anyway and are likely to take things at face value. That means individuals are going to be more likely to be polarized on the ground. But lastly, we told you, and most importantly, that India as a global power and in the eyes of the international community needed to send a very strong impression of what it stood for and what it was willing to stand for. On that side, they send a message that they are Hindu space, that they are solely isolated towards protecting Hindus. And that was not the message that a superpower or global power needed to make, especially in the eyes of other nations. Simply saying the US does it, therefore I should too, is ridiculous in how you analyze yourself as a global power. What have we shown you in this debate? We've shown you that the problem they wanted to solve doesn't get solved by it, but more importantly and more perniciously, they harm India and they harm India's future. We're very proud to oppose.
Give me my chest for my past speech. So. Okay. What is oppression? It's when religion is used to deny a party or a group equal opportunities. It's to say the opinion of, say, Muslims matter less because you are not Hindu. It's to say that Hindu foreigners get priority over you as a minority citizen. Their response to any oppression in Bangladesh and Pakistan, where presumably the government's obligation to protect its citizens is not met, is to get the Indian government to neglect its own obligation to its minority citizens. We find that highly problematic. I'll be dealing with three things today. First and foremost, the logic, the very flawed logic behind their entire argumentations. They tell us two things today. First and foremost, the refugees are Hindu. Secondly, therefore, you get automatic entry if you feel oppressed. Why? What is the link between these two statements? If the link for them is the great oppression that supposedly exists, right, then our counter policy works perfectly fine as well. Because our counter policy will always prioritize the need of these refugees over any religious inclinations. So we think that in fact it works even better than them. Furthermore, if they can only come to India, right, then obviously the need of this refugee is extremely great. So our needs-based policy will therefore apply more to them. We don't see therefore why you need religion as your key entry criteria. What does this mean? This means that there's a truth they're trying to avoid, that the calculus of the government policy is a belief that Hinduism is the core, not a major identity, not a majority faith, but the very core of the Indian government, something they would consider when talking about how all of India identifies with the Hindu community. That is why they think that Hindu refugees belong here over any other refugees. That is why they want to appease Hindu nationalism, though it oppresses the Muslim minority. That is why they dismiss what Muslim citizens will feel and how they'll be impacted. That is precisely the sort of bigotry they perpetrate. And that brings me on to my second point, the fact that there's something problematic about Hinduism being the key and overriding tenet of Indian statehood. Why? Simply because India is first and foremost secular, like the Prime Minister said, and also not a Hindu state. There is a Muslim minority that needs protection. And that is why all our points on Muslim protection matters a lot in this debate. We told you through many examples that the Muslim minority is already suffering in India, right? Firstly, due to the minority oppression. Secondly, because of Modi's ascent of power and his neglect of what the Muslims really need at the expense of Hindu supremacy. But the only response to that really, right, when you condense it is, well, Hindus matter more. Screw the Muslims. We think that exacerbates any problems they have characterized and never deny it whatsoever. Their only response towards the end of the debate is, well, if we please the Hindus in India, right, I guess somehow they're going to love the Muslim minorities a lot more because they feel appeased, they don't feel threatened. Okay, what is the logic behind that? They are saying that Hindus in India will say, okay, I'm so happy that my government is favoring me and my religion, so I will want to have less favoritism towards me. I wrote law what here because that doesn't make a lot of sense. You are saying that favoritism will therefore cure favoritism when the principle of Hindu supremacy is basically to assume that Muslim interests don't matter. It's the most harmful mentality you can create towards any need to protect the Muslim minority. So we realize therefore they haven't really solved the problem and at the same time created even more supremacy. That brings me on to my third point. I mentioned at the start of my speech that this debate will be judged on perceptions of India, since our policy really negates any harms, any oppressions that refugees face on both sides. So therefore the image is as follows. Do you want India to be a protector of Hindus, first and foremost? That's what they want. Or as a secular multicultural state that does respect human rights and therefore does have a needs-based policy towards taking in refugees on a case-by-case basis? We told you many things. Mitra came out and told you that the principle of refugees on our side, right, looks at harm based on an objective metric, not based on religion. We also told you how we're going to not do things locally like boost Hindu supremacy because we still build our temples, right, but we don't bring in other Hindus just because they're Hindu. We also realized how resources for Muslims are drained in the country to great detriment. We realized that originally, I told you, I was not really engaged with, that you boost belligerence in Bangladesh and Pakistan while increasing our willingness to clamp down on minorities, and how you also harm foreign relations. That is why we think perceptions of India are so much worse than our side. In some, right, oppression is when a state leaves a group no place to live as rightful citizens. We realize that what they have painted, therefore, for India is a Hindu supremacist narrative that's oppressive and harmful to all and solves no problems. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Madam Chair, the side that wins this debate is a side that best understands what is it that makes the average Indian man resentful towards Muslims. We say first we're more uniquely positioned to understand this because we live in India, but let's move on from that, right? We told you this. We told you that Mitra may not feel alienated because someone is given a Hajj pilgrimage. Mitra may not feel alienated because Hindu temples are taken over if they're mismanaged. Mitra may not feel alienated if Hindus can need to reserve 25% of their seats for poor people, but Muslim mosques or other Muslim religious institutions don't. But for the average Hindu man, the discourse of secularism has for a very long time been skewed in India. The average Hindu man has started viewing this as a system that unfairly benefits Muslims, that gives privileges to Muslims, but does not give equal privilege to them. Which means, as I told you in my speech, the average Hindu man looks up to the state as something that discriminates against him in favor of Muslims. What our policy does is that it corrects this imbalance. From the beginning, they've told you, what is the link? How do you correct this imbalance through our policy? Simply by making the state look more equal. We told you this repeatedly. By making the state look as an instrument that protects vulnerable groups on all sides. You can't afford a Hajj pilgrimage, we give it to you. You live in some country that races down temples and kills you as you walk onto the street because you're Hindu, we'll bring you over here. We say that is what our policy does, and that's a benefit that they've completely ignored from their side of the house. And there is a slight contradiction within their side of the house, right? Because somewhere in the middle they told you the only problem with this is somehow that we're helping Hindus outside of India. We told you that's not a problem, because if the idea is to correct Hindu perceptions within the country and Hindus within the country care about Hindus outside the country, why shouldn't you help vulnerable Hindus outside the country? But more importantly, how are they going to correct the imbalance on their side of the house? Are they going to withdraw Hajj pilgrimage? Because we don't see how this is going to reduce the resentment of the minorities anymore if this resentment in fact exists, a characterization that we did in fact contest. Or are they going to start giving subsidies to Amarnath pilgrims or Kashi pilgrims. If that's the case, at least in our policy, we're helping those who are genuinely vulnerable. In your policy, you're supposedly helping privileged Hindus go to religious sites simply because they want to. Decide on what your stance really is. They have it till the end of this debate. But then let's compare the idea of what a case-by-case model offers versus what a community-based model offers. The importance of a community-based model offer is this. We told you it offers a distinct symbolic advantage. When you go in front of the masses as Narendra Modi and you say, I'm going to bring Hindus in. This is something that an external affairs minister cannot say. He says, we will review each application on a case-by-case basis. We told you this, they refused to engage with it. Second, Basu particularly told you that when there is a Hindu man and he applies and you deny him a visa, refugee status under this case-by-case model, he has to go back to a country that is so hostile to him. That is a problem that they've again not addressed under their model. Third, we told you that we've adopted a consistent standard that works, that is okay for accepting refugees or accepting immigrants. First, we told you that our standard is in fact a reasonable standard given the special vulnerabilities of Hindus. Their only glib response to this in off-whip was that, what about the Muslim man in Bangladesh? Where can he go? The simple difference is this: the Muslim man in Bangladesh is not persecuted. The Hindu man is. There are Muslim countries around Bangladesh. There aren't Hindu countries. There's only one secular nation, India, with a Muslim majority population, and we will let this man in simply because of that reason. But more importantly, we told you that our standard is okay because it's a paternalistic, beneficial standard. We understand that assessing candidates on the basis of cultural affinity is fine, and because Muslims face more socially unfavorable